Thank you so much for joining me. Um, well, I've discovered Tangle. Um, I think somebody recommended it to me on Twitter, and I've been subscribing ever since. And I really, really enjoy it arriving in my email box. And, I don't read it every day, but I read it a lot of the time. And especially when I notice there is a topic that sort of relates to something I'm interested in the headlines, and I'll just sort of skim the different points of view, and then I'll skip through to your opinion a lot of the time. But maybe let's introduce what Tangle is to the people who are
Yeah.
hearing about it for the first time and have no idea what I'm talking about. How would you describe Tangle?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I like to say that it's our effort at giving people a wide spectrum of views on one big political debate every day. So, the idea is we look out into the space, the political world for things that are driving a lot of conversation, whether it's, foreign policy, an issue like trans rights, anything under the sun that is kind of just, going through the political machine, and then we collect various opinions, some from the right, some from the left, and we aggregate them into our newsletter. We sort of introduce the opinions with, a breakdown of the story with the most neutral facts we can find, share what the left's saying, share what the right's saying, and then I kind of give my own take, which is, I like to say I'm pretty politically incongruent. It really depends what the issue is that I'm talking about. And I very much enjoy punching holes in people's arguments or saying, this is a really good point that made me change my mind. And yeah, we send it out. It's a daily newsletter, Monday through Thursday. And then we have Friday editions that are sort of like interviews or deep dives or a little bit of a different format that are the paid content of the newsletter. But yeah, I mean, I started Tangle because I recognize that conservatives and liberals in particular, I think independents too to some degree, but conservatives and liberals were not getting or reading or interacting with the same news, which I think is a really big problem.
Well, they're kind of going into their own, I guess, echo chambers, as we call them, right? And this is a great place to sort of read the highlights of the strongest arguments. Something that I really like is that whether you were, when you're highlighting the conservative arguments or you're highlighting the liberal arguments, you're highlighting the top arguments, the best arguments. You're not highlighting the cheap shots. And I think that's really valuable, because a lot of the times, even if whether it's Fox or New York Times or whoever, when they're representing, if they even bother to do that, they're representing the arguments from the other side. They're generally choosing the weakest arguments, and I think that presents no value to the audience, right?
Yeah, it is the most common tactic that I see being used in the cable news space for sure. Also in the Twitter space. I mean, it's the crazy megaphone, like you find the person on the other side saying the most batshit stuff about whatever topic you're discussing, and you elevate that person and you try and make it, representative of the entire left or the entire right. But I'll tell you, I mean, this obviously the selection for what we're going to include in the newsletter is one of the hardest parts of the job. And I'm trying to find the arguments that I find most compelling and are most coherent and most convincing. But we also try to balance it in a way where, we're representing what people are actually saying or what they're thinking. We don't want to bury something that's maybe a mainstream argument just because I think it's a crappy argument, because then like my biases are shaping the newsletter. So we really do try and find this nice mix of here's like a very compelling argument that maybe nobody else is making on the right, that's sort of a counterpoint to other conservative voices, or here's like the mainstream argument, this is like the standard bearer talking point that people are hitting, and just make sure that it's not, I'm not just sharing the arguments because I like them, because then it's just, it's an issue with me. But it is, I mean, it is I think the one thing we do is definitely do is we cut out a lot of the fat right away, which is just like the people who are just being totally disingenuous and, either making arguments based on something that is not reality, or making arguments just in a way that's meant to be sort of petty and sensationalist.
So how do you make sure that you do make that argument in a really fair way, that you do represent everything in this accurate, fair way, that you're not letting your own bias get in the way, because obviously you do have your own bias, and you're not hiding that because you have your own take that you put at the bottom. So how do you make sure that you are getting it right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I have a few sort of checks and balances that I put on myself, I guess. The first one is just there should be like a big majority of the arguments that show up in the newsletter should be things that make me feel uncomfortable. And if that's not happening, then I'm like 100% certain that I am, I'm catering to my own views. So when I read something that sort of pisses me off or like makes me feel like this is like I'm, I can see the holes in this argument, whatever, I don't like it. That's like a pretty good signal for me that they're touching some kind of nerve on whatever the issue is, that I should not reject and push that away. I should really strongly consider using it. The other great thing is, especially in the written news space, I have, whatever, 50 or 100 sources from each kind of like conservative leaning or left leaning news outlet that's out there. And I can just look at the stories that they're featuring, the ones that they're making prominent on their opinion pages or their home pages. And to me, that's like a good signal. If Fox News has on their opinion section, they've got the same story that's in like the banner position for 24 hours, then I know that's like an opinion piece that they want their audience to see. That's very representative of what like the opinion editors want Fox News to be putting out. And so that's a good like key to me that, okay, this is like an argument that Fox is elevating. They're sharing it in their newsletters, whatever. It's clearly something they feel is representative of the network's position. And so I'll feature that, even if I think it's kind of a specious argument or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Oftentimes I find them pretty good, but it's just a matter of recognizing when pieces are circulating a lot, they're being shared heavily, like, okay, this is resonating with people who are sharing it, they feel like their views are being represented. So I look for stuff like that and not just my own kind of emotional reaction, I guess.
Well, a lot of people have been complaining about, the media for a long time, and not that many have actually gone out and done something. So I'm curious to know what your background is. If you worked in this space, and what was that, I mean, obviously you were seeing things that weren't working in the media, as you mentioned, but was there like an aha moment for you? And what was the background that sort of led you here?
Yeah, so I mean, my first job ever was at the Huffington Post, which it does not hide their politics. So I'll just say
Oh,
that. I don't think that's a secret. And I was 23. I was fresh out of college. After school, I'd gone to Israel, and was actually living in a yeshiva, in a religious school there, and basically went because it was like 6 months of free rent and food in Jerusalem. And I didn't know what I wanted to do yet after school. And I got this offer to go in this program, and they gave me a writing internship. And it was sort of like hooked me with the internship. And then we're like, hey, we have this religious school you could live in and maybe study in. And it was a very like, Jewish program, which was some of the most intellectually stimulating time of my life. And I got to travel in the Middle East when I was there. And so I was writing to all these news outlets. I was writing essays basically from my trips and then sending them to dozens of news outlets a week, pitching them as pieces, saying I was looking for a job. I was a sports journalist in college, and then decided I wanted to write about politics. And what I like to tell people is, I didn't go work at Huffington Post because I was a big bleeding heart lib. I went to work there because they were the only place that offered me a job.
right.
And jobs in journalism are kind of hard to come by. So I got thrown into the machine immediately. I was there for less than a year, and I saw how it works. I saw how headline editing is done, how stories are leveraged to go viral and get traffic, and the way the framing of a story is adjusted in order to drive traffic to make it more compelling or interesting or emotional for readers, which are sort of like you know really just a nice, kind way, clean way of saying they get more clicks and they get more shares and they piss more people off and they drive more advertising revenue. Um, and when I was there, I left Huffington Post to take my next job, which was actually to start a media company with Ashton Kutcher, the actor who is in a VC venture fund phase.
Okay.
And he started a company called A Plus, where I was one of the first editorial hires. And we did kind of solutions journalism, which is, you know, highlighting people who are fixing stuff, not breaking it. And when I went there, I started publishing, political pieces. I was running the politics vertical under a totally new brand, like a company that did not exist before. And we had a huge Facebook social imprint because of Ashton and some celebrities he had involved. And people would go online, read my piece, and then they would look me up and see that my last job was at the Huffington Post and either totally dismiss everything I had written or trust me because they were liberal.
Mm.
And that was like my original, oh shit. Like it's so bad that it's not even that I'm publishing in the Huffington Post and conservatives are ignoring me. It's that these active readers are looking up where I am. And like the top comment on my article for A plus is this guy worked at Huffington Post. He's total liberal trash, whatever, with 500 likes. And I'm like, okay, so they're not even reading it. It doesn't matter what I write. Doesn't matter what the argument is.
I know the
And
feeling.
yeah, and that's just
So
like,
my bylines, right?
yeah. And that was my, not just are we siloed, but we're so distrustful that it's like you get dismissed like that. And I was, 23. I barely had a political identity, let alone a journalism career. And it was like I was in the box and that was it, and it was over. And pretty much since then, I've been thinking about it. And so, fast forward 7 or 8 years, A plus, I stayed there for a long time and I freelanced for a lot of other places. I've been on CNN, I've written for Time Magazine and Vox and whoever, and I've just seen the sausage get made in various different ways. And A plus went through an acquisition and they sort of made a transition to start doing only video stuff. And that one, I was looking for other jobs, had some final interviews, didn't get them, ran into a bunch of walls. And I was finally just like, I don't even want to work for these places. Like, I really just want to make my own thing. And Substack was sort of just blossoming. And so I had this idea, decided just to send a newsletter to 100 friends and colleagues. And that was really how Tangle started, was just sending people an email in this format with like, here's a story, here's what the left's saying, here's what the right's saying, here's my take. And then let me know what you think about this. And a lot of people wrote back and said, dude, I would read this every day. Like, this makes it so much easier to get, political news. And that was 2019, right around the Democratic primary. So I had pretty good timing, and it turned into the Biden, Bernie, Elizabeth Warren war, and then Trump won the nomination again, or Trump decided to run again, and Biden, Trump head to head. And so we had a lot of really good growth and attention heading into the 2020 election, and have kind of ridden that up till now.
Wow. Well, it's interesting because I did start in journalism, I think, significantly, quite a bit earlier than you, I think, and so somewhere in the early 2000s, and so it's so I've seen it change so much, and I think a lot changed with the internet, and I think politically things have changed quite a bit, and sort of journalistic standards have changed. The editors that I worked with, just the standards. I can't say that it was always across the board excellent. I've definitely seen some of the sausage being made the wrong way, but I've also had excellent editors who've really pushed me to be very specific in my writing, to be very accurate. There were fact checkers that were employed, and not fact checkers in the way that people look at fact checkers with suspicions now, but actual
Yeah.
fact checkers, and made sure that we got information correct. And so I've seen it transform completely, and I'm sort of baffled by the where standards have sort of fallen. And so it's been kind of a remarkable journey. And like you, I've also encountered, because some of my bylines are like the Guardian, the Washington Post, and CNN. People do look at me with suspicion, but I've sort of been earning. I imagine, I don't know if people uh try to put you in a box politically. I've tried to sort of, I've gone through a little bit of, I don't want to be in any kind of box, because I like to make up my mind on different issues and not even, identify as one thing or another. And then sometimes I will identify on a particular side because I do lean one way more, and I feel like it's important to maybe model that, not everyone that particular side is so close-minded, and some people do stick to sort of the old ideals. So sometimes I think, oh, maybe it is important to say that out loud, and sort of kind of go back and forth with that a bit. Do people try to tag you as being, and I think you're pretty transparent though as where you stand, but have you thought, like, do I identify as, a liberal or a conservative, or, wherever you happen to sit?
I get everything, honestly. I mean, I think it depends really heavily on when people sign up for the newsletter, like at what given week. Because I know for sure, I can tell you last week was, heading into the midterms. One of the big stories of the midterms was obviously how a lot of candidates who had questioned the results of the 2020 election were going to do. And through Tangle and other reporting that I've done, for other news outlets, I've done a ton of writing about allegations about election fraud. And I've interviewed hundreds of people. I've been on the ground at polling places. I've observed elections, and I am like very, very convinced and adamant that the 2020 election was above board, and election fraud happens, of course, all these things, but it wasn't stolen. And the people who are saying it was stolen are lying. And we know why they're lying, because it's really profitable. And, and I've kind of been beating that drum to my audience. And so, leading into this week in some my take sections in Tangle, I've sort of expressed relief about certain candidates like Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania or Kerry Lake in Arizona losing, because I think that they're grifters, and I'm comfortable saying that. And so people who are reading Tangle this week, I'm getting a lot of emails from sort of conservative, like Trump right people who are like, oh, great, another like nonpartisan newsletter who's, you're just a lefty and it's all bullshit. And I'm like, I'm not a lefty. I just think these people are grifters. And so like, it like, just address me on what I said. Like if there's something in there that you don't like or you think is untrue, I'm really truly happy to talk to you about it. But if you're unsubscribing because I said something you didn't like, then you're like missing the entire point of this whole enterprise. Then again, in Trump's like final week in office, we did a lot of like reviews of his presidency where I graded the things that he did and talked about, from a pure policy standpoint, like what did he say he was going to do campaign on and what did he actually do? And Trump did a lot of shit he said he was going to do. Like he got a lot of stuff done. He reduced immigration. He expanded the military. He pulled out of wars overseas. He did stuff that he campaigned on. And I said that and gave him a lot of props for it. And, in a week like that, like the last election cycle, I got a ton of people unsubscribing saying like, you're a closet Trumper. I can't believe I've been trusting you for the last 6 months, when really like you just, and the vast majority of my audience, I think, is really rational and even tempered. And they're there because they want to get both sides of the spectrum, and they don't bail. But the people who leave and like make the accusations about what side you're on, I mean, I hear that stuff every day.
Yeah, I mean, like I always say, like my allegiance is to the truth. I don't have to personally like Trump or any other politician to be like, okay, good job on this particular thing. You said you do it, you did it. This thing, not so good.
Yeah.
I think you should be able to, regardless of whether you like a candidate or not, or a politician or not, whether you like them or not, you have to be just honest and just sensible about it. Otherwise, you just do a great disservice and nobody's ever going to trust you. And you're, yeah, and it's just it turned into this. People are just kind of can't be honest with in conversations. I just find it, and I've found this in general, just in my work environments. Whenever I said something, let's say about Trump, that I'm like, well, this specific thing, that's not true. This thing that he's being criticized on, because I watched the whole tape, for example. Well, I'd immediately be accused of being, a Trump lover. Now, with me, people sort of did it teasingly because I had some goodwill in my community, but it's still kind of, I mean, it's the truth, right? All I'm saying is the truth. It doesn't matter. It wasn't about me liking or not liking someone. And
Yeah, I mean, I'll say too, oftentimes what I say is, the accusations that I get are much more a reflection of the people's bias who are making the accusations than my own. I mean, and I tell that to readers who write in these emails. I'm just, I say, look, I think you are maybe further to the left than I am, or you're maybe further to the right than I am. But I think you accusing me of being on this other side of the spectrum is way more about your own strong partisan political beliefs than where I am on the actual spectrum when you zoom out, at the 30,000 foot level. Because I do think my politics are like pretty close to the center if you took them all in aggregate. And it's like there are certain issues that again, I feel really strongly about, and I understand why people might peg me one way or the other, but I'm also like, I just reject the premise of the question. It's like I don't like being called left or right or liberal conservative. I'm not even sure what those words mean
well,
anymore.
it pegs you into specific positions, right? That almost become immovable. It's like you can't, now you have to identify with all of this or all of this. Like when I really explore my own views about certain positions, I'm like, well, you know what? I'm kind of progressive on some things. I might be a little bit conservative on some things. I might be libertarian in some areas. Like, and so when you put people into these boxes and now they're sort of forced to commit to these things, but like our ultimately what we have that's much more consistent are our values. Everything else, I think it's more about ideas, and you it doesn't always fit so conveniently, and things change as well.
Yeah, I mean, and also should be open to your own views changing. I mean,
Right.
that's for me, even just the process of doing this newsletter every day and immersing myself in, more progressive or more conservative political news and getting that diverse opinion every day. I mean, that my views are different now than they were 3 years ago on a lot of issues because of the process of doing this newsletter. And exposing myself to more content and different information that's out there versus like being in whatever silos I was in before. I mean, and I think that's like that's been a pretty interesting thing for me to experience and kind of realize that this, you know, reading Tangle, producing Tangle has affected me in a really deep way. And so I imagine if people were to read it a lot, it would also have a big impact on them and their views and the way that they kind of view the world, because your opinions change or should change when you get new input, and not enough people are kind of willing to allow that to happen.
Yeah, there's like a weird stubbornness to want to cling to certain viewpoints. And I don't know if I fully understand why it's so important for people to maintain that viewpoint, why there isn't like more flexibility in terms of, I guess, because I have actually I have the opposite problem. I change my mind quite frequently, quite easily, and I jump around when I'm presented with new information, and maybe even too much. I'm too prone to jumping around. So it's hard for me sometimes to understand why is it that people make it such a critical part of their identities and find it so difficult to move their opinions? Like, is it do you think it's because it's their community, it's their tribe, is it tribal?
Yeah, I mean, that I was the word that I was going to use was, I think it's community. I mean, I think it's
Mm.
I think the I mean, and tribalism is a great, synonym. I mean, it's people are they attach themselves to a certain political view or political cause. They surround themselves with people who share those views and those feelings. They spend time with them. They become their friends. They hear that stuff being said and done, and then it's either agree with the whole palette of views that are out there on that side in that tribe, or get kind of ostracized for it. And the right and the left are both guilty of that, and I think there's a tremendous amount of pressure there. I can say from personal experience, living in Brooklyn for 5 or 6 years and having a ton of friends who I love deeply and care about deeply, who are very progressive, and hearing something said at like a party or we're hanging out or whatever, that's like a political position that I'm like, oh, I don't think that's true or right at all. And then, like, feeling the pressure of like, if I say this, do I want to have this 30-minute conversation and like maybe burn this friendship or not? And it's that I think, there's been tons of social science and some great books written about this phenomenon of people who are now, their communities that used to be sports teams and bowling alleys and knitting clubs and whatever, are now political groups and political tribes. And that creates a really, really big incentive, I think, for you to stay kind of entrenched, which is a kind of scary thing to think about.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that. Maybe because I'm much more of a loner that I have less. No, but I do see that, and I definitely bit my tongue a lot for many years. And I did not discuss. I mean, I wasn't even very political. I didn't really discuss politics. It's just that I started seeing how that was affecting my immediate world and the people within it, and how it was kind of hurting people, that I started feeling that it became necessary because it was this kind of silencing culture, where people were sort of being hurt by the fact that we couldn't talk more openly, that there was this tremendous division. And so it felt more important to be able to speak to each other. And I've discovered that a lot of people were actually feeling this way, including in these like very sort of left leaning communities, because they were, a lot of people didn't want to speak because they didn't want to have that 30-minute conversation, right? And they almost felt a sense of relief when somebody would bring up maybe a different point of view because they shared it and were just afraid to speak. And so, felt more connected as a result, being able to sort of express it and without real judgment or anybody jumping on you. Do you feel like, what kind of subscribers do you get? Do you feel like there's more liberals or more conservatives? Is there a balance?
Yeah, I will actually know pretty precisely. I mean, we have, I think about 40% of our mailing list self-identifies as liberal and about 25% conservative. And then the rest is pretty in the middle or independent, or, kind of fringe left or right, where they're like, I'm not a liberal. I'm like a Green Party, whatever. So yeah, I mean, I feel really good about that. I think that split is probably much more diverse than most news outlets have. And I also know that I'm climbing an uphill battle with conservatives because they feel really burned by the media, and I'm a journalist by trade. I'm not like a random conservative political activist who decided to start writing, which like a lot of people in the conservative media space are. And so they earn trust with people on the right a lot easier than I do. And people can still find out I worked for the Huffington Post 10 years ago when they go look me up online. So it's a much bigger challenge to win over, I think, conservative readers and subscribers. And I'm trying to meet them where they are in a lot of places, just in terms of, advertising the newsletter or the content we're covering or whatever. because it feels to me like if my audience was just entirely left, then I'm not really changing anything. I'm not helping. But I think that's just kind of the social dynamics. It's like it's the same thing that's happening in the polling space right now, like pollsters think they're undercounting the kind of Trump right conservative vote, because when you work for the New York Times and you call somebody randomly on the phone, you say, "Hey, I'm a pollster with the New York Times. Can I talk to you for 10 minutes?" A Trump voter is a lot less likely to stay on the phone and give you their time. So that's definitely a challenge that I run into. But yeah, we have a pretty diverse readership. And I think for the most part, everybody's there for the same reason, which is like they're really curious about what the other side's saying and what their views are, which is an encouraging sign to me.
With your subscribers, I mean, I imagine that they talk back a lot, that you hear from them. Yes. So
Yeah.
clearly that is the case based on your reaction. What have you learned from them?
Man, that's a good question. I mean, first of all, I think I've learned that, I don't know how tangible this is, but I think I've learned that a lot of people are really screaming into the void and feel like they're screaming into the void. One of the most common things that happens to me is I get a really pissed off email and somebody says some like vaguely horrible thing about how I'm like a terrible writer and wasting my time and whatever. And I write them back and just say like, "Hey, I read all these emails. I work like super hard on this newsletter. I think you're kind of taking, my words in a way that I didn't intend them.
Right.
Here's what I meant about what you're talking about. If you want to have a real conversation about it, like I'd love to hear your perspective." And I mean, like 99% of the time, the people who reply are like, "Holy shit, I didn't think you were going to read that." Like that is like one of the most common things. It's just like, "I'm sorry, I feel like a jerk. Thanks for writing me back." And I learned a lot that most people, especially those people who feel like their voice isn't part of the conversation, they're leaving a comment on Facebook that gets buried amongst thousands of others, or in the comment section of Washington Post or Breitbart or wherever. And they don't feel heard. They don't get seen. They don't have that kind of personal connection. And it's one of the great advantages of the newsletter platform, where it's a very intimate thing to kind of be in somebody's inbox. So I've learned that for sure. I think generally speaking, I think a lot of Americans are experts in like one or two things. And that has been really interesting for me, because anytime I write a newsletter about any topic, and we chase the news. So we're not doing breaking news, but for instance, last week we wrote about the elections in Brazil. So I don't know anything about the elections in Brazil. I don't know. All I know about Brazilian politics is like Bolsonaro's relationship with the United States and what he's done. And like, Lula wants to save the rainforest, and that's like it. So I spend a week, hours a day reading about Brazilian politics and watching YouTube videos and translating Brazilian articles online from Portuguese to English and listening to podcasts, so I can get like a basic understanding of it, and then find these writers who I know are trustworthy or popular, who have like strong histories of reporting on Brazil and sharing their perspectives. And then we put it in the newsletter. And then I hear from 10 readers who are like, live in Brazil, or a diplomat in the US for like some Brazilian politician or something. And it doesn't matter what the topic is. Tangle has, I think, a little over 50,000 subscribers on our mailing list now. And at that level, there are like 4 or 5 people on any given topic we write about who are just straight up experts in it, which I found really interesting. Is just, you know, you think about what that means politically, and it's like there's always gonna be, for any individual you pluck out of the country, there's going to be like one or two issues that they know really intimately, and that they're probably seeing a bunch of people who are in office screwing up, and a bunch of journalists who are writing about it misreporting it. And that creates certain trust, distrust, animosity towards that politician, animosity towards the party. And I found that like a lot of Americans are, at least the ones I interact with, they are really defined by like a couple key issues that they actually care a lot about or have personal experience with, or they feel like are fixable and nobody's fixing them. And those are usually the kinds of emails that are really fun for me to get, is somebody saying like, hey, this is, I'm a lawyer who's fight, this just happened. We wrote about a Supreme Court case, and one of the people who wrote in was like a litigator who was working under one of the lawyers giving the oral arguments in the Supreme Court case, and wrote in anonymously and was just like, this is like, you did some really comprehensive coverage here. I'm not seeing anywhere else. I just wanted to say great job. And like, I didn't see any errors or anything. And I'm like, oh, awesome. And sometimes they're not nice emails, but it's just cool to know that, everybody has their thing out there, and, their own story and experience to tell. And it's a really big and diverse and interesting country that we live in here in the US. And it's really hard to keep everybody happy. And, you just kind of have to accept that that's sort of part of the game when you're sharing your opinion publicly about politics.
Do you ever feel like after the fact, after your newsletter and your take has gone out, you've changed your mind about something? How does that, if has that happened, and how do you feel after the fact? Do you have that urge to sort of correct it?
Yeah, for sure. It happens actually pretty regularly. I mean, I've had readers push me out of positions. Um, I can give you sort of two examples, kind of going in opposite directions that have happened recently. I mean, I wrote about the Chesa Boudin recall in San Francisco, and I think I took a pretty left of center position, which was like, people are kind of, they're overreacting to 2 years of these like crime rates when no prosecutor is going to change the city in that amount of time. And on paper, I actually like a lot of his ideas, and I was bummed. I was like, I wish San Francisco is a huge major city with a big homeless problem, a big crime problem. It would have been really awesome to see him sort of see those next, like, get 10 years in office and see if he could actually make change. Cause I know how hard it is from a governmental perspective to change stuff. And I heard from tons of readers who lived in San Francisco who were just like, dude, you're off. Like, he sucked. He ruined, like, he ruined a lot of really basic stuff in the city. It is like basically unlivable here in downtown San Francisco. Like, not people in the Bay Area, but people who are like living in the city. Personal stories about crime and homelessness stuff they experienced. I had some mom who wrote in whose son basically, killed himself in like one of those like public recovery centers where people can use drugs, observed by the government, and was just like, he should have been in jail because he would have gotten sober. That's what I wanted. Like, just like this huge gamut of stuff. And so I came out a few weeks later and said like, I got a ton of feedback, and I think my position changed a little bit on this. And here's like how I would moderate if I were to rewrite the newsletter. Here's what I would say.
Uh,
Yeah, last week I wrote about Elon taking over Twitter, and I took like a pretty standard right-wing position of, I think everyone's overreacting. I don't think Twitter's going to change that much. I think like it's great that the company's going to get some more diversity. This guy is a genius, and he's like created all these amazing things. Just like, let's see what happened and give it some time. I think the last 2 weeks have been a fucking disaster. I mean, like, he seems like he is just completely shooting from the hip and totally unprepared, and firing a bunch of people who are really smart, and acting like a total clown on Twitter, which he always does. But you would think like maybe
as
for
a
a minute,
CEO, yeah, he would.
yeah, he would like play nice and put his like grown up hat on. And I'm like, oh, maybe this is just like a really super rich 15-year-old troll, and that's just like who he is. So, I haven't followed up on that position yet, but right now, as it stands, I'm like, oh, I think I maybe got that wrong, and Elon's actually like a total ass, and I should probably say that at some point. So, it happens a lot. And there were tons of readers who hated my position on that and let me know about it. And I'm hearing from them now. They're like, so what do you think? because they're watching it unfold too. And I think it's clear it's a little bit of a shit show. So
Well,
yeah,
I
it
think people
happens.
forget that, we can be wrong about things, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like that happens. We don't have all the information. We can change our mind, and especially, you have this like fantastic feedback loop, having these 50,000 people potentially around the world, right, giving you this feedback. I think there isn't like that structure for most traditional media where you can have these updates. Oh, okay, they got this a little bit wrong. Let's update this viewpoint. There's very rarely this kind of follow up that happens. I sometimes have gone back even in my Substacks because I kind of rethought things, and I've updated occasionally when people have given me a little bit more to think about. But I think generally there's like this kind of static nature to a lot of the media. Like the article goes out, and it's kind of it. So I think there's like a lot of dissatisfaction, obviously, in general with the media as is. And while I'm not ready to sort of bury the whole media industrial complex completely, um, I do feel strongly there needs to be a lot of change. Curious to know where you think the future of journalism is heading. Do you think it's the future is newsletters, Substack, and different kinds of models? Do you think there's a chance that sort of traditional media will fix itself? Is it more in the hands of independent journalists? What are your thoughts on it generally?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I tend to feel that the future is kind of here. I mean, I think, first of all, I love to criticize the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and Fox News and all the biggest players out there, but I can't do what I do without them. I mean, I exist because they exist. I'm following the news trends that they're starting in some ways, or if they're not starting them, they're certainly publishing content from writers who are talking about them or reporting on those issues. And I lean on them heavily as like a source of information or to understand what people are interested in. And, the key is having that sort of bullpen of really diverse politically news outlets. But the independent creators don't exist without them, in my opinion. And I see it a little bit out there, like the kind of hubris that's coming up from some of the like Substack folks and whoever who are sort of blowing up. And I'm just like, I'm with you. Like I'm on the mainstream media has screwed up, and we are army of people who are a good check and balance on them. But let's not pretend like, we could do what we do without them sort of setting the agenda in terms of the reporting that they're doing and the stories that they're writing and all that stuff. And I think it's a good balance. I think the tension that we have right now is really healthy. I think it's very clear to me, the writing's on the wall, that the video space is, I think the pivot to video we had like 10 years ago in the journalism world that I'm sure you experienced was just like way premature. But if you just look at YouTube and TikTok and how the next generation gets their news, I think that's going to be a really dominant space down the road. I'm actually hoping at some point in the next year to launch a video version of Tangle, a YouTube channel of some sort that's sort of doing like a video version of our content, because I think I think it's going to be a really good way to communicate with the next gen. And some of them are totally going to graduate into email and like get off TikTok, I hope to God. But a lot of them are, I think are going to get used to getting their news from video. So I don't think New York Times and Wall Street Journal and CNN are going anywhere anytime soon. I think that they are now a lot less able to sort of dictate what the masses think and feel, because there's so many people out there who are watching them like hawks. And I think that's really good, because I think they screwed up a ton in the
I
last few
hope
years.
they self-reflect a little bit more, because I think what's missing is a little bit of self-reflection. I mean, I'm also not. I think some people are so harsh, like it's complete. These are complete monsters, and I think they forget. I think they hyper focus on these like very political biased stories, but these publications also do other kinds of stories, and they're not all badly done stories. There's other kinds of story content that they produce that's not all political, all ideologically driven, and has value, and they have big teams, and they do have good writers. So I think it's more important for people to sort of figure out who those writers that they can trust are at these publications. um, but I do hope that they do a little bit more self-reflection, and why do people hate us? And it's not because Donald Trump said fake news, and so all these Trump supporters now hate us, because it's not just Trump supporters. It's people on every side of the aisle that are feeling like they're not getting what they should be, and the standards are different. And I think journalists are activists, right? And there is a difference between something like, Tangle, where you're presenting kind of several points of views, and then you're very transparently then sharing your own viewpoint, which I think is perfectly acceptable. Or, when I wrote for these big publications, I did write very objectively. I did not present my own viewpoints. Now, when I'm writing on Substack, it's completely my point of view. It's all opinion, but I'm also transparent about that, and that's okay too. So I think there's room for that kind of um, editorial content, right? But not when you're covering the news. And so I think I think the transparency is really important, having these standards, and also what you're choosing to cover, and sort of the responsibility of what you're putting out in the world, and the proportions, whether how accurately are you representing what is going on in the world. If you're constantly presenting as if there are, a million shootings in the world, right? Like, people are going to be scared to go out, but maybe there's only, 10 shootings, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky thing, and I what I say often is I can pick any given event, that happens, whether it's like today, I'm sure you saw there's like this breaking news that some missiles were shot out of the sky and landed in Poland, or maybe they weren't shot out of the sky, but two people died in Poland. Everybody's freaking out. World War III is trending on Twitter. Not a good day. Uh,
Yeah.
and you could go read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times right now cover this exact same news event, and their articles will look really different. They'll use different leads, they'll have different sources, they'll frame the story around a different, center focus, and that is an expression of bias. And those are, the journalists there are the highest paid in the country with the biggest editors, the most resources. They should be the best journalists. I think they probably are the best journalists, but they come out with a totally different story. And that's just like proof of the fact that it is every news story is kind of an act of bias in its own way. There are fair journalists and there are hacks, and like delineating between the two can be hard. Some people are trying their best to do an even-handed job, but maybe their sources are a little biased that they've built over the years. And so my like premise of Tangle is you can't really do that. You can't really have a totally even look at all these things unless you're reading the same thing from multiple different sources. And we're trying to make that super easy for people and just sort of like put it all in one package where they can get everything in a one-stop shop, I guess.
It must be very difficult on a daily basis, when there's like so many things happening, deciding which one makes it into Tangle, which one doesn't. How do you decide that?
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, story selection, any journalist will tell you, is an act of bias too. I mean, choosing
Yeah.
what to cover and where to drive your attention, I think is really, it's part of the issue. It's, when conservatives complain about the New York Times, it's not just that they wrote an article that had bias, it's that they're not covering an issue they think is really, they're not writing about the border enough.
Right. Or they're
Um
putting it on page 73, or
yeah, exactly. And so I try, first of all, I take cues from various homepages, like again, just making sure I'm looking across the spectrum, like what is dominating, oftentimes what is on the homepage of National Review and Fox News is not what's on the homepage of Huffington Post and the New York Times. And so if I were just looking at one side or the other to get those, I would always be making like an act of bias by choosing what to cover. If I was just like, okay, this is on the homepage of the New York Times, we're going to do that today, then we'd end up with this really kind of more left of center, left leaning story selection. So I do that. I just like, if it's getting dominant coverage in any kind of, openly biased sort of news outlet, then I know one side definitely cares about it. I know we should definitely be covering it. Readers help a lot. I poll readers in the newsletter on Twitter. I get emails every day, people saying, hey, I really wish you would cover this. Um, there has to be enough conversation that there are like, for the Monday through Thursday editions, I need to bring together like these different various opinions. So there needs to be enough conversation around a topic that I can get opinions from both sides on it. Otherwise, it's more like Friday edition. If we want to cover something because nobody else is covering it, then we might do that. Um, and then, I try and look for stuff. One of the tricky things is I try and look for stuff that I think there's really a divide on. I mean, the newsletter would be pretty uninteresting if
Right.
everybody just thought the same thing. So that is a little bit of a trap that I worry about, is I'm kind of reinforcing the political divides I'm trying to break down, because it makes it seem like, oh my God, there's so many things we disagree on. And my resolution for that is oftentimes I can find people, one person or a few people from both sides, who are sort of saying a similar thing, and there's some common ground and agreement. But I do worry sometimes, like that's one of the things where I'm like, am I just kind of reinforcing this like whole tribalistic shtick that is just sort of like an illusion? But it's I think ultimately it does more good to help people understand, what each side is sort of championing or arguing, than it does to pretend that like we totally agree on everything. So I just have to let go of that sometimes, but it's hard.
What has surprised you most about Tangle? Is there something that people agree on or embrace on both sides, or is there something else that maybe has surprised you?
I mean, when I started, I was really unsure about whether it would work. I mean, if you told me 3 years ago that, we'd have 50,000 subscribers and this would be my full-time job, I would have been so pumped and shocked. And I am, now that I'm here, but I think maybe the shock has worn off a little bit, but
Fair.
I really didn't know that there would be like an organic interest, because we're just being told that like people don't want to change their minds, they're stuck in their biases, whatever. And now it's, when I meet somebody and they ask me what I do and I tell them about the newsletter, I mean, 8 times out of 10, they pull their phone out and sign up right there on the spot. I mean, it's like very compelling and interesting to people. And I've just realized that pitch is so easy because so many people actually genuinely want it. And I think that was pretty surprising to me. I think I have a much more optimistic view of the country now than I did when I started, to be honest, which is not what I was expecting to happen, I don't think.
I love that. I'm somebody who tells people about Tangle all the time as well, and I forcefully signed some people up,
Thank you.
including family members. So
I appreciate it.
yeah, well, no, I appreciate it existing. So it's funny. I think I told you this before, but it was something I was dreaming up something somewhat similar, but I didn't make it happen. You did. So I'm glad that it exists. And I think that's the important part. And I guess my final question to you is what do you see, in the pie in the sky future of Tangle? What's your dream with it? Where do you see it going? You mentioned video. What else?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, we have a few things sort of cooking up, I guess, in the short term, and definitely I have some dreams for the long term. I think in the short term, I put a ton of research and work into every newsletter, and I want to sort of squeeze the most out of that. So, getting our content on different platforms to reach different people is really important to me. I think email is definitely, it's a lot easier to get people over the age of 30 to sign up for a newsletter. The video space is one way we're going to get into, I think, tap into a little bit of a younger audience. I hear from a lot of teachers who want to use Tangle in their classroom, which I think is really cool. So
Okay.
we've been thinking about, making a formatted newsletter where maybe my take is removed, and instead there are like 5 discussion questions for every newsletter, and signing up teachers for something like that. That's like a really exciting idea, just to
Love
get
that.
high school kids, in the mix thinking about it. Um, and then long term, I mean, you know, I trust me, I have an entrepreneurial spirit. Like, I want to make money and build a business, and I'm not shy about that part either. And I think it'd be really cool to have a small, well-paid team. I'm not trying to build the next CNN, like I want a group of 5 or 6 people who are really mission oriented, care about what we're doing, and we perfect these products that we're putting out, and do that sort of at the U.S. politics level. I think there's a world where maybe we try to bring this to some other countries. That
Canada.
yeah, Canada. Yeah, I mean, so obviously it probably is no surprise to you. Our second biggest readerships in Canada. We have a ton of readers from Australia and France and even Mexico as well. And I hear from people all the time in those countries like, hey, is there a Tangle Canada, Tangle France? And I say no. And then they're like, sweet, can you like get on that? Cause I want to read this for, and the model for that, I don't think would be super hard. I mean, I think it's, you know, Tangle Canada, you brand it, you have $100,000 of money in the bank, and you sign somebody for like a year and a half contract and say, show me what you can do. Can you build this list out? We'll promote you. And eventually that newsletter should be paying for itself, and the
The
list
Tangle
grows.
franchise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And like I that would be really cool. The idea of sort of franchising it out is actually something that's really interesting to me. Um, and then I've also thought about like jumping verticals, is another thing that's kind of fun. I think the model would be the same as like the franchise, but a Tangle Sports where we're doing like a sports debate every day, I think would totally work. I get, a ton of people who are like, hey, are you going to cover like Will Smith slapping Kanye West? And I'm like, no, that's not really in my wheelhouse, but it makes me think, damn, if I had a culture newsletter, we could do the debate. That would be really cool. Because people disagree in all sorts of different spaces. So yeah, I think there are some different ways to go with it, but I got to make a lot more money and find some more hours in the day before I start doing any of that.
That's fair, but definitely a lot of options to grow, which is the options are the important part. So you're kind of set up for that.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. I mean, we definitely gotta keep improving what we're doing now, and get this to a really well-oiled machine point. And I'm currently trying to work a little bit less than I do. The 12 to 14 hour days, 5 or 6 days a week is not sustainable.
Not
So
sustainable, but I am excited to see how the Tangle empire grows. And then one day you'll just be like puppet.
yeah, I hope so.
And then people will be like, oh, he sold out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It never stays the same. It can't. You gotta accept that.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for bringing Tangle to my mailbox every day. And thank you so much for joining me for this chat. Really
Yeah,
great
thanks. It was a
talking to you.
blast. Yeah, I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Likewise.